In the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of Luton Airport, a man blends perfectly into the crowd of weary international travelers. It is September 2012. And to the casual observer, 53-year-old Mohammed Samar is just another businessman arriving from Karachi on a standard visa. He carries himself with the quiet confidence of someone who has done this a dozen times before. The routine is practiced, almost theatrical in its precision. Fly in, meet with associates, discuss logistics, and fly out. As he approaches the customs desk, the officer scans his passport, asks the standard questions about the purpose of his visit, and stamps him through without a second glance. To Samar Haytini, the stamp is a green light. To the unseen eyes watching him, it is the springing of a trap. Outside the terminal, the grey English sky greets him as he slips into a waiting car. The vehicle navigates through the streets of Luton, eventually pulling up to a substantial residence on Marlborough Road. This is the stronghold of Mohammed Habib. At 39, Habib is the younger, sharper face of the operation, a man who has successfully hidden one of the region's most lucrative illicit networks behind a veneer of suburban respectability. Inside, the house whispers of wealth, plush furniture, expensive fixtures, and the quiet obedience of family members upstairs who know exactly when to vanish. Samar settles into the comfort of the living room, accepting a cup of tea from his host. The conversation is coded but clear. The latest shipment arrived 2 days ago, without incident. The logistics were flawless. And the payment? Habib simply gestures toward the ceiling. The funds are in the usual place, ready to be counted the following morning. It is a simple equation that has worked for years. Product flows in, money flows out. Efficient, profitable, and seemingly invisible. However, the invisibility they rely on has already been stripped away. 3 houses down, parked innocuously on the street, sits an unmarked van. Inside, officers from the National Crime Agency (NCA) are huddled over monitors, watching the scene unfold in real time. This is not a spur-of-the-moment stakeout. It is the culmination of months of painstaking intelligence work. They have tapped phones, tracked financial footprints, and mapped the entire hierarchy of the organization. They know exactly who Samar is, the critical bridge connecting the suppliers in Pakistan to Habib's distribution network in the UK. Arresting Samar in Karachi would have been a diplomatic and logistical nightmare, nearly impossible to execute. But arresting him in Luton, that was the strategy. The moment Samar entered the house, the NCA commander received the confirmation they had been waiting for. The target was contained. But patience remained their greatest weapon. They would not strike immediately. The plan was to let the associates conduct their business, gather more incriminating evidence, and lull them into a false sense of security. The radio crackled with the order, "We move in 72 hours." Samar finishes his tea, oblivious to the digital crosshairs painted on his back. He heads upstairs to unpack and rest, believing tomorrow will bring another profitable day of counting cash and planning future shipments. He lies down, thinking of the flight home, completely unaware that he will never see Pakistan again. The countdown has begun. In exactly 3 days, the doors will come off their hinges, 5 lives will be dismantled, and a criminal empire that took a decade to build will be brought to its knees. To understand the magnitude of the impending raid, one must first understand the architecture of the empire being targeted. The story of the Luton connection did not begin in that comfortable living room on Marlborough Road. It began over a decade earlier, in the late 1990s, with the arrival of 2 brothers seeking a fortune that legitimate employment refused to yield. Mohammed Habib was the first to touch down on British soil. Young, hungry, and driven by a relentless ambition, he initially tried to play by the rules. He worked the grueling shifts, familiar to many new immigrants, sweating in restaurant kitchens and lifting boxes in warehouses. But Habib quickly calculated that the ceiling for honest labor was too low for the lifestyle he envisioned. In Luton, minimum wage meant survival, not success. So he pivoted. He began small, testing the waters with low-level cannabis distribution. It was low risk, high volume, and it taught him the fundamental rules of the street. He was astute, disciplined, and remarkably careful, avoiding the petty mistakes that land most amateurs in a cell before they ever make real money. By the early 2000s, Habib had graduated from street-level transactions to supplying the dealers themselves. But the operation truly evolved into a dynasty with the arrival of his older brother, Mohammed Khalil. At 49, Khalil was a different animal, entirely cautious, methodical, and fiercely loyal. They formed a partnership that was as strategic as it was criminal. They carved up the region into personal fiefdoms to maximize efficiency and eliminate internal conflict. Habib reigned over Luton, while Khalil established his command center in nearby Bedford. They were separate entities on the surface, but beneath the table they were two halves of the same brain. By 2005, the brothers had transcended the role of mere dealers. They had become importers, stepping onto the international stage, where the risks were lethal, but the profit margins were astronomical. Habib leveraged connections in the Netherlands, organizing routes from Amsterdam and Rotterdam to flood the UK market with MDMA and cannabis. Meanwhile, Khalil utilized his deep ties back home in Pakistan. He established a pipeline from Karachi and Lahore, facilitating the transport of high-purity heroin. Together, they constructed a sophisticated logistical network. The product arrived through a maze of couriers, hidden freight compartments, and commercial shipping containers. They had effectively cornered the market in 2 counties, offering high-quality product at prices their competitors could not match. Crucially, they learned that longevity in this trade required distance. They stopped selling directly to users. That was dangerous work for desperate men. Instead, they positioned themselves at the top of the pyramid as wholesalers. They sold to the dealers, who took the risks on street corners, insulating themselves from the day-to-day grit of the trade. By 2010, the operation had swollen to a size that 2 men could no longer manage alone. They were moving significant volume, and with that volume came a tsunami of cash that needed to be managed, hidden, and cleaned. The brothers realized they needed more hands on deck, but in a world built on secrets, you do not hire strangers. You hire blood. The time had come to bring the next generation into the fold. In any illicit enterprise of this scale, the product is rarely the biggest problem. The problem is the paper. When a criminal organization generates hundreds of thousands of pounds in street-level revenue, that cash becomes a physical liability. It is heavy, it is bulky, and you cannot simply walk into a high-street bank and deposit £50,000 without triggering alarms. To solve this logistical nightmare, the brothers turned to their nephews, Yazdani and Rabbani Ghulam. Aged 32 and 31 respectively, the Ghulam cousins were the perfect candidates for the role. Living on Kirby Drive and Beresford Road in Luton, they were the picture of suburban normalcy. They were quiet, respectful neighbors who kept their heads down. To the outside world, they were struggling to make ends meet. In reality, they were the financial arteries of the entire organization. Their role was distinct from their uncles. They never touched the heroin, never negotiated with the suppliers, and never met the importers. They dealt exclusively in the aftermath. Their routine was as disciplined as a corporate payroll schedule. Every week, the dealers would make the call, collection ready. Yazdani or Rabbani would drive out, collect the proceeds stuffed into plastic carrier bags, £10,000 here, £20,000 there, and return to their safe houses. There, surrounded by stacks of small denomination bills, they would count, bundle, and record every penny in simple, spiral-bound notebooks. These notebooks were the only ledger the organization kept, a paper trail that would later prove catastrophic. But once the money was counted, it had to move. The organization utilized a 2-tiered system to clean their revenue. The first tier involved local cash-heavy businesses. A restaurant owned by a cousin or a car wash, run by a trusted friend, became the perfect laundromat. Dirty cash went into the till, and legitimate-looking receipts came out. It was a classic method, effective for smaller sums, but insufficient for the volume Habib and Khalil were generating. For the heavy lifting, they turned to the ancient and shadowy banking system of the Middle East and South Asia, Hawala. The Hawala system relies entirely on trust and operates outside the traditional banking grid. The nephews would take the bundled cash to a local broker in the UK. The broker would take the money, make a phone call to a counterpart in Dubai, and instruct them to release an equivalent amount to the organization's accounts there. No physical money crossed the border, no wire transfers appeared on bank statements, and no suspicious activity reports were filed. It was a ghost transaction. From Dubai, the funds were easily moved to Pakistan, landing directly in the hands of suppliers like Samar. This completed the cycle. Product arrived in the UK, was sold on the streets, and the resulting cash was vacuumed up by the nephews. beamed invisibly through Dubai, and returned to Pakistan to purchase the next shipment. For their efforts and the immense risk they carried, Yazdani and Rabbani took a modest cut, roughly £30,000 a year. It was enough to live comfortably, but not enough to buy Ferraris or mansions that would attract the gaze of the authorities. They drove average cars, wore average clothes, and followed the golden rule of the underworld: stay invisible. For years the machinery worked perfectly. The money moved in a silent, endless loop, enriching the uncles while the nephews kept the gears oiled. They believed their system was impenetrable because they believed no one was watching. They were wrong. The National Crime Agency had not only identified the pattern, they were recording it. Every bag exchanged, every meeting logged, and every invisible transfer was being added to a growing mountain of evidence. The nephews thought they were the cleaners. In reality, they were leaving fingerprints everywhere. By January 2012, the investigation had shifted from a theoretical exercise in data analysis to a full-scale tactical operation. It began not on the streets, but in the quiet confines of the National Crime Agency headquarters in London. An analyst, sifting through mountains of financial data, noticed a persistent anomaly. A series of significant, unexplained cash transfers originating from specific postcodes in Luton and Bedford, all destined for the same financial hubs in Dubai. In isolation, a single transfer might look like a business transaction or family remittance. But when viewed as a dataset, the pattern was unmistakable. It was a digital heartbeat, pulsing with a rhythm that perfectly matched the suspected importation of illicit goods. The NCA escalated the case, bringing in Bedfordshire police to provide local knowledge and manpower. They needed eyes on the ground. By March, the digital investigation manifested into physical reality. Surveillance teams installed covert cameras on utility poles and in parked vehicles surrounding the key addresses: Marlborough Road for Habib, Tewkesbury Road for Khalil, and the nephews' modest homes. The investigators became the silent audience to the family's daily theatre. They watched, recorded, and waited. What they saw was a masterclass in logistics, but also a display of hubris. The surveillance footage captured the mundane yet incriminating rhythm of the enterprise. Cars would pull up to Habib's driveway for meetings that lasted less than 5 minutes, just long enough for a conversation and a handshake. More damning were the nephews. Agents watched Yazdani and Rabbani crisscrossing the town, entering various locations empty-handed and leaving with bulging plastic carrier bags. To the uninitiated, it looked like groceries. To the detectives, it was the visual confirmation of the collection run. The bags did not contain milk and bread. They contained the street revenue that fueled the entire machine. Simultaneously, the technical team was listening. Phone intercepts revealed a network that spoke in riddles. The conversations were guarded, filled with vague references to tickets, paperwork, and guests. There was never an explicit mention of heroin or MDMA, but the context was glaring. "The package is ready, or we need to sort the accounts," became the soundtrack of the investigation. The investigators began to overlay the phone data with the financial records and the surveillance logs, creating a three-dimensional map of the organization. By June, the picture was complete, but one piece of the puzzle remained elusive: the source. The NCA knew Habib and Khalil were the distributors, but they needed the origin point to truly sever the head of the snake. That is when the analysts flagged the travel patterns of Mohammed Samar. They noticed that every time the organization prepared for a massive influx of product or a significant outflow of cash, Samar was in the country. He was not just a visitor, he was the architect of the supply chain. He was the guarantor of the connection between the poppy fields of Pakistan and the streets of Bedfordshire. The strategy crystallized. They could have raided the nephews months ago, seizing the cash and charging the foot soldiers. But that would have alerted the generals. Instead, the NCA commander made the call to play the long game. They would wait for Samar to return. His presence in the UK would be the trigger mechanism. It was a high-stakes gamble, allowing the network to operate for several more months, but the reward was total dismantlement. When Samar booked his flight from Karachi for mid-September, the trap was set. The warrants were drafted, the tactical teams were briefed, and the date was circled. The investigation that had started as a blip on a computer screen was about to end with the sound of a battering ram. The morning of September 18, 2012, began under a veil of deceptively calm darkness. At 5:45 a.m., the streets of Luton and Bedford were silent, save for the occasional passing delivery truck. But in the shadows of Marlborough Road, Tewkesbury Road, and the quiet suburban streets where the nephews slept, the silence was about to be shattered. Dozens of tactical vehicles had moved into position, cutting their engines and lights as they approached the target locations. Inside, officers checked their weapons and adjusted their body armor, waiting for the signal that would synchronize the takedown of 5 separate strongholds. At precisely 6:00 a.m., the radio silence broke with a single command: strike. The reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. At Mohammed Habib's residence, the front door did not stand a chance against the battering ram. The sound of splintering wood and the concussive shout of "Police, stay where you are!" filled the hallway before the occupants could even register they were under attack. Officers flooded the property, moving with practiced efficiency to secure the perimeter and the people inside. Upstairs, Mohammed Samar was jolted from sleep in the guest bedroom. Confused and disoriented, he was met not by a business associate, but by the barrel of a police firearm. The man who had traveled thousands of miles to oversee an empire was handcuffed in his pajamas, his journey ending in a chaotic blur of shouting and flashing lights. In the master bedroom, Habib was found waking up, his expression one of resignation rather than shock. He knew the risks of the game he played. He just had not expected the game to end today. As the suspects were secured, the search teams moved in. They did not have to look hard. The arrogance of the operation was laid bare in the physical evidence scattered throughout the house. Hidden in wardrobes, stuffed under beds, and bundled in bags, they found the lifeblood of the organization: cash. The haul at Habib's house alone was staggering. Officers began pulling out bundles of notes, 50s, 20s, 10s, stacking them like bricks. The final count on site was £140,000 in loose currency, waiting to be laundered or shipped. It was a visual representation of the scale of their trafficking. But this was just one location. Simultaneously, miles away in Bedford, Mohammed Khalil's door was breached. The older, more cautious brother was taken into custody without a struggle. At the nephews' homes, the scene was repeated. Yazdani and Rabbani, the men who believed their hands were clean because they only touched the money, were arrested in their bedrooms. The evidence against them was even more damning than the cash, the notebooks. The search team seized the spiral-bound ledgers that detailed dates, amounts, and names, a comprehensive diary of their own criminal conduct. By 8:00 a.m., the sun had risen, and the operation was technically complete. All 5 targets were in custody, transported in separate vans to separate police stations to ensure they could not coordinate their stories. The NCA headquarters began to receive the initial reports of the seizure. The physical cash, combined with the ledgers and digital devices, painted a picture of an operation that had moved millions. In a span of 2 hours, the Luton connection had been severed. The supply line from Pakistan was cut, the distribution hub in Bedfordshire was closed, and the financial laundering mechanism was dismantled. However, as the adrenaline of the raid faded, the cold reality of the legal process began. The evidence was overwhelming, and the Crown Prosecution Service authorised charges immediately. But in the UK legal system, there is a gap between arrest and trial, a gap called bail. And it was in this bureaucratic space that Mohammed Khalil saw a flicker of opportunity. The chance to make one final desperate move that no one saw coming. In the days following the raids, the 5 men sat in separate interview rooms, facing investigators who held all the cards. The strategy from the defense was uniform: silence. No comment was the only phrase uttered, a standard tactic to force the prosecution to prove their case without a confession. But the evidence seized the mountains of cash, the detailed ledgers, and the surveillance tapes meant that silence was a futile shield. The Crown Prosecution Service moved swiftly, charging all 5 with conspiracy to supply Class A drugs and money laundering. The first major battle was not the trial, but the remand hearing. The courts had to decide who stayed in custody and who could go home pending trial. For Mohammed Samar, the decision was instant. As a Pakistani national, with no ties to the UK and a serious flight risk, he was remanded immediately. Mohammed Habib, identified as the ringleader of the UK operation, was also deemed too dangerous to release. The nephews, Yazdani and Rabbani, were granted bail, their younger age and lack of prior convictions working in their favour. Then came Mohammed Khalil, the older brother, the partner, the man who controlled Bedford. His legal team argued that he was a homeowner, a long-term resident with deep community ties, and therefore not a flight risk. In a decision that would haunt the prosecution for years, the court agreed. Khalil was released on conditional bail. He was ordered to surrender his passport, report to the police station weekly, and stay at his home on Tewkesbury Road. He signed the papers, walked out of the courthouse, and breathed the air of a free man. His solicitor likely warned him to prepare for a decade behind bars. The evidence was insurmountable. But Khalil had no intention of stepping inside a prison cell. He returned to his home, but he did not pack for prison. He packed for a ghost life. For weeks, he played the part of the compliant defendant. He reported to the police station. He stayed visible. But behind the curtains he was liquidating what assets he could, destroying documents and reaching out to the deepest contacts in his network, the ones the NCA had not found. He needed a route out that did not require a passport. By October 2012, the preparations were complete. When his next check-in time at the police station arrived, Khalil did not show up. Officers were dispatched to his residence, expecting perhaps a medical emergency or a misunderstanding. They found an empty house. The furniture was there, but the life was gone. Mohammed Khalil had vanished into the ether, leaving his brother, his nephews, and his business partner to face the music alone. The trial began in October 2013 at Maidstone Crown Court without him. In the dock sat 4 men and 1 empty chair. The prosecution laid out the anatomy of the empire, using the very ledgers the nephews had meticulously kept to convict them. The jury did not need long. The verdicts were guilty across the board. The sentencing was draconian, designed to send a message to anyone watching. Mohammed Samar, the linchpin, received 25 years. Mohammed Habib was handed 20 years. The nephews, who pleaded guilty hoping for leniency, were shattered by the reality of the sentencing guidelines. Yazdani received 7.5 years. Rabbani, over 5 years. And for the empty chair, Mohammed Khalil was sentenced in absentia to 10 years. But as the judge read out the punishment, the irony was palpable. The court could pass the sentence, but they could not enforce it. Khalil was gone. The operation was destroyed, the key players were locked away, and the streets of Luton were quieter. But the story had one final, bitter sting in the tail. The government did not just want their time, they wanted their money. They initiated proceedings to confiscate the profits of the crime, unaware that this legal maneuver would highlight the ultimate failure of the system to contain the one man who got away. For most criminals, the slam of the cell door signifies the end of the story. For the Luton network, it was merely the beginning of a second, more bureaucratic nightmare. The British legal system possesses a powerful weapon known as the Proceeds of Crime Act poker. The logic is simple. You should not be able to retire on the millions you buried before you were caught. In November 2015, 2 years after the initial sentencing, the case returned to court. The goal was to quantify the empire's value and strip the convicts of every illicit penny they had earned. The figures read out by the prosecution were astronomical, a testament to the sheer scale of the operation Habib and Khalil had built. The court issued confiscation orders demanding the repayment of the organization's criminal benefit. Mohammed Samar was ordered to pay £500,000. Mohammed Habib was hit with a bill of £498,500. Even the nephews, Yazdani and Rabbani, faced orders of £180,000 and £150,000 respectively. The total demand exceeded £2.1 million. The ultimatum was brutal: pay the full amount within 3 months, or face default sentences, additional years added to their existing prison terms. It is a trap with no exit. The money, of course, was gone, funneled into the black hole of the Hawala system, spent on lifestyle, or hidden in offshore accounts that the authorities could not touch. None of the men paid. Consequently, the trap snapped shut. Habib's 20-year sentence was extended by nearly 5 years, bringing his total to almost 25 years. Samar's sentence ballooned to nearly 30 years. The nephews, who had hoped to be young enough to rebuild their lives upon release, saw their release dates pushed further into the future. They were now serving time, not just for their crimes, but for their debts. But the ultimate irony of the entire saga centers on the empty chair. The court determined that Muhammad Khalil, the fugitive brother, had benefited the most from the enterprise. He was slapped with the largest confiscation order of them all, £671, 656. The court added a theoretical default sentence to his record, meaning, if he is ever caught, he will serve his original 10 years, plus nearly 6 more for non-payment. Yet, these numbers are meaningless to a ghost, somewhere in the world, perhaps back in the chaotic streets of Karachi, or hiding in plain sight in a European city under a new name. Muhammad Khalil is living the life his brother and partner paid for. He is the only one who kept the freedom to spend the money, while Habib marks the days on a calendar that extends into the next decade. And while Samar grows old in a foreign cell, Khalil remains the singular glitch in the system. The Luton connection was dismantled, the cash was seized, and the books were closed. But the story ends with an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, if you are fast enough and ruthless enough to leave your family behind, you really can get away with it.